you, Alex. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on culture shock and cultural adaptation. I'm Brianna Harrison and super excited to present to you today. What we'll go over is just a brief kind of overview of culture shock and cultural adaptation. We won't dive too deep into the weeds, but I do want to give you kind of a way to prepare for study abroad or working abroad or even just traveling. So what we'll go over is an introduction to culture, talking about what it is. Then we'll dive into cultural differences, culture shock, cultural adjustment and adaptation, and then we'll open it up to questions at the end. All right. So the first thing is, what is culture? And there are quite a few definitions of culture depending on your school of thought or your field, but I just have a couple of definitions here. Hofstede, who is a social psychologist, says that culture is the collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes the members of one group from another. In other words, learned behaviors, beliefs, and values that are particular to a specific group of people. And I like to think of it as the way in which groups of people address basic human needs. We all need to eat, sleep, socialize, and culture is how we as groups of people address those needs, what we eat, when we sleep, how we socialize, etc. So we like to think of culture in like anthropology um, through a metaphor of an iceberg. So consider an iceberg. You can see parts of culture, like the tip of the iceberg, but there's so much more underneath, beneath the surface that you can't necessarily see. So think about things that you can see in a culture and things that you can't see, things that are deeper beneath the surface. For example, I like this graphic because it also shows the emotional level attached to each level of culture. So the surface of culture, parts, things that you can see, food, dress, language, games, holidays that you celebrate, all of those things are on the surface. And then when you get a little bit deeper, you see things like courtesy, what's viewed as polite, if you're allowed to touch other people. And there's a little bit more of an emotional level that's attached to that. But as you get even deeper into these unconscious rules that even the people in that culture might not realize are happening, you have um, the notions of adolescence, the concepts of aging and attitudes towards aging, problem solving, and what your role is in society based on your age, sex, class, etc. So all of these things make up culture, and then some of those things are just easier to see, while others you really have to study the culture to know what it is. So when we go over the aspects of culture, we like to wonder kind of what determines what our culture is. And there are quite a few determinants as well. So the first one is geographical, national, and regional culture. Um, and this is what I'll be talking about for the most part, but there are also other determinants of culture, like the organizational culture, the culture of your school, and intrinsic individual culture. So more like your personality, and then your extrinsic factors, things like family, generation, religion, education, and language, all kind of mix together and help you to interact with your culture, your national or regional culture. So someone might experience the culture of the United States a little bit differently if they are raised in a family that's very religious versus a family that is not religious at all. All of those things kind of work together to um, determine how you react or to interact with different people. And so all of those things, that's what culture is. And now we want to get into cultural differences. And before we do that, I want to talk about generalizations versus stereotypes. So I'll be talking in generalizations, but stereotypes is the claim that everyone in a particular group is exactly the same. It's based on a small sample size. You meet two or three people and you say, all people from this country are like this. It's unchanging no matter what new information you get. You always think of them as these types of people, and it's used to judge a group of people. So all people from this country do this, and that is bad. So that's a stereotype. But generalizations are broader statements that most people generally have similar characteristics in a group. So it's based on a larger sample size, deeper studies, the information changes, and so your ideas about the culture change, and it's used for educational purposes like preparing to go abroad. And so now we can get into these cultural differences generally. And one thing that anthropologists and sociologists have done is try to divide culture and define it in kind of digestible pieces. So Gert Hofstede, the person that I mentioned before with the quote at the beginning, um, divided culture into 6 dimensions: power distance, individualism and collectivism, masculinity and femininity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term and short-term, and indulgence and restraint. So I'll go over each of these individually. So power distance is how comfortable you are with hierarchy, or are you more egalitarian? Do you use honorifics? Do you call your boss by their first name? So these types of things go under power distance. Individualism and collectivism is, does the individual come first when making decisions or when interacting with people, or does the group come first? If you're more individualistic, that means you take care of yourself first, and then you, as a functioning member of society, can contribute to the group. Or do you make sure everyone in the group is doing well so that in turn you can do well also? So that's individualism and collectivism. Masculinity and femininity is a bit outdated, and they've changed these terms a little bit, but it's basically task orientation and relationship orientation. Is it more important to complete a task or to build and maintain relationships? Uncertainty avoidance is how comfortable you are with risk. So are you more averse to risk, or are you willing to take risks? Short and long-term orientation is when making decisions, is it more important to look to the future or reflect on the past? And then indulgence and restraint is, to what extent do we indulge in what we want? Now, Hofstede has this cool kind of tool online where you can see where your country or where your country of interest falls on these dimensions. So, for example, US culture, you can go into the tool and plug in the United States, and it shows you the score from 0 to 100 of where your country falls on these dimensions. So, for example, we're relatively low in power distance, so we're more egalitarian. And we're relatively high in indulgence. So if we want something, then we will indulge in that desire rather than restrain or refrain from it. And the tool also gives you explanations for all of them um, and what it means to fall in these particular buckets for these dimensions. You can also, on this tool, compare multiple countries. So I've done the US and China, and it shows you side by side what the differences are. So the US and China are very different, as you can see, in power distance. So in China, they're generally a lot more hierarchical. Um, they might use someone's title versus their first name, for example, in a work environment. And indulgence is also a huge difference. So in China, they're generally more likely to refrain from overindulging in what they want or what's most comfortable, again, for probably the benefit of the whole group. So you can see where your country and another country falls in relationship to each other. I've also done China and South Korea so that you can see the differences between two Asian countries, but you can see that there are still some huge cultural differences, particularly under uncertainty avoidance. So in South Korea, they're generally a lot more willing to take risks than in China. So Gert Hofstede has these six dimensions of culture. But again, just like with the definitions of culture, there are a lot of different dimensions of culture that you can think about. And another person who broke these cultural aspects down into dimensions is Andy Molinsky. And he wrote a book called Global Dexterity, which is a great tool for learning how to adapt to different cultures. So I highly recommend that book. And he broke the aspects of culture down into the dimensions of directness. So how straightforwardly you communicate, enthusiasm, how much emotion and energy you're expected to display, formality, how much deference and respect you're expected to demonstrate, assertiveness, how strongly you're expected to express your voice and your opinion, self-promotion, how much you're expected to speak about your accomplishments, and personal disclosure, how much you're expected to speak about yourself. If you kind of uh, separate work and home life, or if those kind of blend together. So what I want to do is also dive into one particular aspect of culture and where differences are a lot more likely to kind of be on display is communication. So there's, of course, verbal and nonverbal communication, with verbal being how you communicate with words, including your tone, clarity, volume, and speed, along with what you say. And then there's nonverbal communication, which is the communication without words, things like eye contact, touch, appearance, facial expressions, and proxemics, or how closely you stand to the person you're talking to. So with these differences in communications, there are a few main buckets of communication styles, types of communication styles. So we have direct, which is to the point. You say exactly what you mean, and the focus is on accomplishing a task. Whereas indirect communication styles, you kind of talk around the point. What you mean is implied, so not explicitly said. And the focus is to build and maintain relationships. And you still want to get things done in indirect communication styles, but you want to get those things done while keeping a relationship intact or strengthening that relationship. And then low and high context communication styles. For low context, verbal communication is the primary carrier of meaning. And typically, if you're in a low context communication style culture, you're also in a more direct culture. And then high context is nonverbal communication is the primary carrier of meaning. So those things like touch and gestures, silences might have meaning. And that's typically found in more indirect communication styles of cultures. And I'll go over a couple of examples of what this looks like in the next couple of slides. But first, I want to show you kind of where a few countries might fall on this spectrum of direct and indirect and low to high context communication styles. So as you can see, Germany is at the top of the direct communication style cultures, while Japan is all the way on the other end, toward the indirect communication style. And the United States is right there in the middle. And it's important to note that this is all relative. Someone from the United States might go to Japan and accidentally insult someone or hurt someone's feelings by being too direct. If they say, hey, do you like this idea? And the American person says no, like outright and directly, that might be kind of a shock to the person they're talking to. Whereas that same American goes to Germany and might frustrate their German counterpart or a coworker or a schoolmate with how indirect they're being. So it is really a spectrum. And as you can see here on the right side, where you are on direct and indirect kind of corresponds to where you fall on low and high context as a national culture. So Germany is there, very low context. The meaning is in the words, and China is very high context where the meaning is more nonverbal. So what does this look like in practice? Um, Here are some situations and how the same situation might be communicated in indirect and direct communication styles. So I'm not going to go over all of them, just a couple, but for giving feedback on performance, particularly if someone misses a deadline, in an indirect communication style, you might say, I've noticed the project deadlines have been challenging. Maybe we could look at our time management strategies. And direct communication styles, you might say, you missed the project deadline. We need to improve your time management. Or requesting help. In indirect communication, you might say, it seems like the workload has increased lately. Do you think you might have some time to assist with this report? And directly, you might say, I need your help with this report. Can you please assist me? And for indirect communication when addressing a conflict, you might say, I value collaboration and I'd love for us to find a way to ensure all voices are heard in meetings. While directly, you might say, you keep interrupting me when I speak. I'd appreciate if you let me finish my thoughts. So notice that with indirect communication, those phrases, those sentences are a lot longer than the direct communication style. So um, there's more talking, but of course, in those cultures, they're typically also more high context. So there might be additional gestures or facial expressions that are used to convey meaning. Another good example is if an American student goes to study in Japan and they stay with a host family, and the host mom says, oh, wow, there are a lot of dishes in the sink, and smiles. What does that mean? Probably do the dishes. But that might be missed by an American um, who is more used to a direct communication style. If a Japanese student comes to study in the United States and stays with a host family and the host mom says, can you please do the dishes? That might be a little bit more of a shock. And the student might feel like the host mom was too direct, rude, pushy, all of those things. So that's kind of what happens when these cultures collide. And of course, you get culture shock. So when you're faced with another culture, culture shock happens when you feel uncertain, confused, uncomfortable, or anxious when you face a culture different from your own. And it happens in phases. And we talk about this kind of graph where this line here is your mood and it changes over time. So you get to a new culture, to a new country, and you're in your honeymoon phase. Everything is awesome. This is great. The food is great. The people are nice. The city is beautiful. And then things happen. Someone says something like, um, can you do the dishes? Or they say something like, wow, the dishes are really need to get done, and you miss that. And now your host mom is mad at you because you didn't do the dishes, even though she asked you to, right? So this results in feelings of discomfort or anxiety, and you go down, your mood goes down, and you're in culture shock. Fortunately, on the other side, you recover and you adjust. So you learn how to communicate and you understand those things that are said to you, maybe more indirectly, um, and your mood is back where it was during your honeymoon phase. Now, this graph was made in the 60s, and we've since learned that culture shock happens a little bit differently. And it really looks more like this, where it's an up and down in your mood. The line is still your mood, your emotions over time. And you still start off on this honeymoon phase where, wow, everything's great and the people are nice and the food is good. And then again, something happens and you realize you did something wrong or someone else did something that maybe hurt your feelings, and there's culture shock. And one of the symptoms of culture shock, which we'll get into in a second, is homesickness. Um, and you want to go home, but you don't. You stick it out, and your mood slowly goes up as you realize that you can adjust and you know now what people mean when they say certain things. And so your mood goes up, but not quite to the level of the honeymoon period. And you realize some things are annoying, but you can deal with them. So instead of indulging and blasting your AC all day when it's hot, you have to open a window instead, and maybe bugs fly in, but that's okay. You can deal with that. And your mood goes up and down until you realize, I can live here for a little while. I can stick it out. I can stay here. And it levels out, and your emotions go back to normal. Things are normal and neutral as you get used to where you're living. So, what does culture shock look like? It's different for everyone. Both the symptoms and the intensity of the symptoms are different for everyone. But it might result in homesickness. It might look like sadness or depression, irritability or anger, a lack of confidence, being overly critical of the host culture, maybe stereotyping a little bit, isolation, pulling away from the community around you, disrupted sleep. And then, of course, if you're not sleeping well, if you're sad or angry and isolated, it might come out through physical symptoms, like especially if you're having to think in another language all the time, you might get headaches. So these are the symptoms of culture shock, or some of them. And it's also important to note that you shouldn't be scared of them. Culture shock is not a bad thing, it is a good thing. It means that you're experiencing another culture. It means that you're hopefully learning and growing from that other culture. So you can kind of mitigate the symptoms or relieve the symptoms, and we'll go over that in a second. But also realize that these symptoms aren't bad. Don't be afraid of them, and don't kind of resent yourself for them. Give yourself some grace when you experience culture shock. So, how to relieve these symptoms? One way is to journal and then look back on what you wrote after a few more weeks so that you can see how much you've improved in those few weeks. Do something that you enjoy. If you enjoy singing, sing, go to KTV. If you are a foodie, go to a cool new restaurant. Uh, do things that remind you of home or contact your family. One thing I did in Beijing when I studied there is every now and then I would go to Papa John's. And of course, I would get like the cool salmon pizzas, but I would go to Papa John's and sit there and enjoy a pizza, and things just kind of slowed down for a little while until I was ready to re-enter Beijing, right? And then learn as much about the host culture as you can. So this is part of the growing piece. When you learn more, you're starting to understand more, and those symptoms lessen because they're not as shocking. Get involved with the local community. Join a club or go to festivals or parties, or really get involved. Volunteer if you're able to. Those are good ways to relieve some of the symptoms of culture shock and learn. And then stay positive. Remember, you're doing great. Remember, you're learning. And just think of it as a way that you are growing, as I said. And so now we're going to talk about, once you're in the country, your adjustment and adaptation. And the first thing you can do to adjust is prepare really well. Um, so how do you prepare? First, don't assume. Don't assume you know everything about the culture. Don't assume you don't know anything about the culture. Just don't assume that everyone is going to be a certain way. You might meet someone who kind of goes against the culture, or maybe there's a regional culture that you weren't aware of at first. So don't assume that you know everything or don't know anything about the culture, but do your research. So use the cultural dimension tools that I used before, um, and there are others as well that you can use. Um, Read current books about cultures. So culture changes over time. So if you're reading a book about Vietnam from the 60s, that's obviously going to be a lot different from the Vietnam you're going to experience going in 2026. So please read current books about cultures and about adaptation. Like I said, Global Dexterity by Andy Molinsky is a really good one to read. Look at online country profiles. So just if you look up country profiles, do a quick Google search, you can typically find a lot of profiles on a lot of different countries. And then consume the media from that country. Watch movies, watch the news, watch dramas, listen to music. You can really learn about what's important to people in that country and what they value and what they believe. So that's a good way to research as well. It's also important to know what resources are available to you upon arrival. So if you're studying abroad, know what your host school or your study abroad program offers in terms of maybe housing, if they provide you with a cell phone, if they provide you with mental health services. Those are all good things to know before you go abroad so that you can take advantage of them when you get there. Talk to people who have been to your host country, or even better, the city that you're going to. It's great to talk to people who are from there. It's also great to talk to people who are not from there but went there. And that's a good way to get an idea of what it's like to be an outsider going into this new culture. Take a cross-cultural training course. This, as I said, is a great workshop for that beginning surface level stuff. But if you want to dive deeper, you can take a course that might go a few weeks if your school offers it, or if your job offers something like a cross-cultural training course, please do take it and have a growth mindset. Remember you're learning, and remember that you're able to learn and able to improve. So definitely do those things. Now for adjustment, there are quite a few ways that you can adjust, and a lot of them are similar to alleviating the culture shock symptoms. So first, you want to confront your biases and be careful not to overgeneralize, not to stereotype. If you start to think of everybody is this certain way and that's bad, reevaluate and think about what's really going on. Remember that there's no universal polite. So, what's polite in one culture might be rude in another culture. If someone does something that you find rude, reevaluate, think about, is this rude where I am? And certainly ask people if that kind of behavior is the norm. Understand the why behind behaviors. So don't just look at that surface level of the iceberg, really dive deeper into the values and belief systems that go into the culture. And it's great if you can ask people why they do certain things. So definitely go out into the community and make friends so that you have people to ask if you're kind of stumped on the why. Know the other culture. So that's doing your research, like I said before, and then know your own culture and know yourself. Cultural adjustment takes a lot of self-reflection. So definitely take the time to do that. That's why I recommend journaling, so you can really look inward and see what you're learning and what you still need to learn. Initiate relationships across differences. Like I said, make friends that you can ask why things are certain ways, and also find a mentor from a different cultural background. They're another great person to ask why things are the way they are. And they're also a great resource. for maybe finding a job down the line. So you definitely want to make those mentorship connections too. And of course, as I said before, participate. If someone invites you to dinner, go to dinner. If someone invites you to their house, like, go and really experience what it's like in that culture. And another piece of adjustment that's also from Andy Molinsky's book is stretching your comfort zone. So Andy Molinsky says that if you step out of your comfort zone, that's uncomfortable, right? And when you're uncomfortable, you're not really working at your best. Um, you're nervous and you're angry, you're upset. So you want to stretch your comfort zone more than step out of it. And the way you do it is like this. So every culture has a zone of appropriateness, which is kind of like a spectrum of what's acceptable in that culture. So not everybody is going to do everything the exact same way, but things are still generally accepted if they do things close to the same way. So if you find that you're in a culture where you are expected to talk more about yourself and your achievements, and you're not the kind of person who usually does that, then you might do something like write down all of your achievements the night before you have an event where you'll be talking about them, and then practice different ways to say those achievements without sounding like you're bragging. Or you can talk about yourself and then highlight the team around you. So I achieved this and I did it because my team helped me to do this. So that's kind of stretching your comfort zone. You're not going all in and talking about yourself like you're the best person in the world right away, but you're having um, these areas where you can kind of stretch um, and exercise that behavior without feeling too uncomfortable. So that's another good way to adjust to a different culture. So before we end, I want to talk about one more culture shock potential, and that is visibility. So as we are mostly foreigners going to Asia, and Black foreigners going to Asia at that, we will be highly visible in our host country. And that means it's very obvious when you look at us that we're not from there. So it's another kind of challenge to not be visible at all, to kind of blend in with the local population. But being highly visible does come with its challenges as well. So one thing is the locals might not be used to seeing foreigners, especially Black foreigners. So there might be a lot of staring. You might have pictures taken of you or with you, and you might get a lot of attention. Now, when I studied abroad in Asia, I loved it. That was one of my favorite parts about studying abroad in Asia. But not everybody experiences that the same way. They might feel kind of put on the spot or even insulted. So be prepared to experience that. And one way to kind of help ease the anxiety that might come with that um, is to engage with the community. Be just as curious about them as they are about you. So if they ask you questions, ask them questions. And that's not only a good way to kind of keep a conversation going and get to know people, it's a good way to get to know the culture and it makes you feel a little bit better. And then, of course, have a sense of humor. That's a good piece of advice overall. Uh, if someone asks where you're from, you might want to say, like, where do you think I'm from? Instead of kind of scoffing and telling them where you're from over and over and over again. So definitely have a sense of humor and have fun abroad. And now I can open it up to questions.